Welcome, beloved, to A Mystic in Christ. This podcast is here to help you remember yourself as one beloved of God. Each word is offered to help you feel how deeply seen, held, and chosen you truly are. Because in reality, nothing stands between you and the presence of love. Only a thin veil of forgetting. May these moments together be a bridge to remembrance, lifting the veil and carrying you home into the arms of love you never left. I'm your host, Neriya, and together we listen for what love wants to say. So let's dive into today's episode. Welcome home, beloved, to A Mystic in Christ, where intimacy is a pathway to the divine. I'd like to start this episode by telling you a story. A few summers ago, I went to a satsang. After the gathering had ended, a man approached me. We had noticed each other during that evening, and clearly there was a spark of attraction between us. So we went for a walk and we started talking. The conversation flowed easily. We talked about spirituality, awakening, sacred relationship. And he told me he'd been following the teachings of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, aka Osho, for many years. And that he clearly didn't agree with the Wild Wild Country documentary, and we had a vivid discussion around that. And talked about spiritual teachings and teachers. And then we also came to Christianity, and then he just mentioned that his wife was a Christian, and I looked at him and was like, "Oh, you're married?" I didn't know because he wasn't wearing a ring. So I just looked at him, paused, and then there was a strange tension there, and then he just quickly tried to brush it off, and he said, "Oh, but it's an open relationship." Clearly there was tension between them around then, not just because the relationship status, but also because she was a Christian and he was more like a, maybe some would call it New Age guru follower of Osho. And there had always been like this struggle between them, and they couldn't really agree if their relationship should be polyamorous or monogamous. So there's been a lot of back and forth between them. And according to him, like her spirituality was restrictive, whereas his was liberating, free. So he told me he felt drawn to me because he was searching for something else, something that his wife and the mother of his child apparently couldn't offer him. In reality, he was really looking to meet the divine feminine in form. And maybe because they had been together for too long and had gotten used to each other, they couldn't have that level of depth anymore. So he was looking for it elsewhere. And that was the moment something inside of me became very clear. So I told him gently but firmly, "I'm not going to engage with you unless your wife knows and gives her full blessing." That was like a clear boundary for me. But he just sort of brushed it off and dismissed the concern like immediately. And he just said, "Oh, but she knows. She knows." But clearly something about the way he said it meant that she really didn't, at least not in the way that he was presenting the whole situation. So I quickly realized that I was being invited to become his secret lover, meaning he thought it was totally okay that I should betray our sister in the name of spiritual exploration and his gratification. So I said no. I walked away, and for me that was it. But afterwards he texted me and he was so offended. He genuinely felt hurt by my refusal, as if I had rejected something very special and sacred. That moment stayed with me for like a long time, because really it revealed something deeper about the way sexuality and spirituality is often treated in our culture, especially in the West, especially in spiritual circles and conscious communities. And the more I've reflected on that, the more I saw that this moment was sitting right at the intersection of two very different cultural stories around human sexuality. Stories that many of us have inherited through generations, and neither of them, at least in my experience, actually leads to real love and homecoming. So there are two cultural extremes in the Western world today. And the way we perceive sexuality is often shaped by these two opposing narratives. So, on the one hand, there's purity culture. And on the other is what I sometimes call spiritualized promiscuity culture. At first, they may look completely different, two different polarities. But if you look at them more closely, they share something really important in common. Both are deeply uncomfortable with the deep feminine. And here's how. If you grew up religious, purity culture may be familiar to you. Even though I personally grew up atheist or agnostic, I heard many stories, like horror stories even, from friends and clients and, through different media channels, people who grew up in those religious spaces. Stories such as these. Young women being told that if they had sex before marriage, they were like chewed gum. Yes, you heard that right. Or now one, a piece of tape that has lost its stickiness. Once used, no longer valuable. I also heard stories of couples who were engaged to be married and deeply committed to one another, yet still they were ashamed by their priest for moving in with each other before they actually got married. Meanwhile, there are our narratives around religious leaders who shame people like that all over the world, and then later they're being exposed for their own sexual affairs and abuse and immoral behavior. Now, I want to say this kind of hypocrisy is not unique to Christian denominations. It has appeared in many different institutions. And psychologically, it reflects something very, very old. A split that has existed for centuries, at least the last 2,000 years. And that is what psychologists call the Madonna whore complex. Where women are either elevated as this idealized version of Mother Mary, the Virgin, who's like pure and sacred and free from sin, and the eternal Virgin, or they're portrayed as the repentant prostitute, like the Mary Magdalene archetype, where she's like sexual, shameful, seductive, and trying to derail Christ from his purity. But you can't be both. You have to be either one. And even in the historical misinterpretation of Mary Magdalene as a repentant prostitute, it's like that is so ingrained culturally, even though the church has restored her in the 1960s that she's not a prostitute. That was a false decree that Pope Gregory had put up on her in one of his sermons, and they took it back. The cultural narrative is still there. They give in many church denominations, like she's still saying, oh, she's the whore, Adding to that, like over centuries, like theological interpretations founded in the thinking of church fathers like Augustine of Hippo have helped create even deeper suspicions towards the feminine and sexuality itself. So this has just been like deep ingrained pattern of fear and misogyny that spans back millennia. And the feminine is often blamed for temptation. You can trace that narrative all the way back to Eden, where the woman was blamed for the fall. So that kind of shaming of the feminine and fear of feminine sensuality and sexuality is basically what like shaped the ground for like the purity culture that you can still see today in most cultures, even if you're not growing up religious. Like slut shaming is so prevalent, and And that kind of fear of sexuality and of the feminine and that kind of repression, it doesn't heal anything. It just shoves things underground, and then they come out in these unhealthy ways that I just mentioned. So that was one side of the spectrum, one extreme, the polarity. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's the what I sometimes call new age spiritualized promiscuity culture. Like that's the other extreme. And that's sort of like the backlash from the 1950s very religious church-going culture, when in the 60s and 70s, teachers like Osho and Chogyam Trungpa came to the West and introduced a radically different perspective on sexuality. So when their teachings came, many Western seekers encountered those teachers from the East who spoke about liberation from oppression and sexual freedom. And for many of those people who were raised in very strict religious environments, like that felt like freedom. Like, wow, and I get it. It's like when you're told for decades and through generations that your desire is sinful and that your blood is dirty and then like your sexuality is like should be shut away in a closet and all the repression, of course it feels liberating. And in fact, like even though I didn't grow up religious, I also had that theology of like sexual liberation. I know that feeling really well. I moved in those tantric, conscious sexuality, spirituality circles for many, many years, and I truly believed in that open relating freedom narrative. I was in these circles. I even had a tantra teacher whom I wrote blog posts for on how to have healthy open relationships and how to handle the pitfalls and how to make it all work. And at the time, it seemed really progressive, spiritually advanced, evolutionary, conscious, you know. But however, over time, I began to notice something and experience something in my own life that felt really, really troubling to me. Because as with all things in this world of duality, everything can get distorted by the ego, right? If you're not really, really aware, the ego will grab anything for itself. So now it happened with the whole narrative around sexual liberation and sexual freedom is that it kind of tilted too much towards the other extreme. It became more and more extreme in the other end of the spectrum. So in some of these communities I moved in, sexuality gradually became tied to some kind of spiritual status. It was almost like a prerequisite to awakening, like you had to be open, otherwise you were considered boring or contracted. Especially in, tantric circles and conscious communities. I've seen it all over the world. And, like the typical pattern again, like men who had many lovers, they were like admired and sometimes even treated as especially advanced and awakened. There was this slow emerging of this really strange narrative that began to appear in people's minds, maybe even like inspired by books by David Data, like The Way of the Superior Man, and where there was this cultural narrative of when these men like develop certain sexual skills and they become better lovers, they're like special, and their sexuality is such a powerful gift that it can't possibly be contained in one relationship because the world needs this gift, and then there are so many women who are like not met the way they want to be met. So it's like I've seen men creating this masquerade of being like this man, this white knight in shiny armor, who now comes to the rescue of all these undernourished women who are just longing to be open to God by their amazing sexual prowess. And the story behind it went something like this. It said monogamy is boring, Monogamy is of the ego. Monogamy is fear-based and contracted. And real spiritual freedom means loving many people and not having any limits. So, and if their partner felt uncomfortable with that, well, that was her problem. It wasn't his behavior. It was her jealousy, her insecurity. She was called controlling, needy, hysterical, and basically, again, being shamed. Yes, women were being shamed for expressing their emotions, for actually asking for real commitment. And just like the feminine had been shamed in religious purity culture for wanting sex, for being sexual, on the other end of the spectrum, in New Age promiscuity culture, she was suddenly shamed again, not for being too sexual, like that was a good thing, but for being too attached, like for being too needy, jealous, controlling, possessive, or whatever they would call her. So it's like, oh, okay, again, we're back at square one. The feminine is being shamed and blamed, and it's just a different wrapping. But it's the same story all over again. Whereas purity culture says your sexuality is dangerous, promiscuity culture says your boundaries are the problem. But in either way, in both systems, the feminine, the feminine, I say the feminine energy in all of us, the part of us that longs for commitment, depth, devotion, safety, deep bonding, attachment, that part is treated as inconvenient. And I've seen that in men also. So this is not a gender war here. I've seen men like deeply suffer because the feminine in them was shamed too. So I'm speaking not between men and women. This is really about the masculine, the feminine. And the feminine in men has also been shamed and repressed for centuries. So just to make that clear, it's either suppressed or just downright dismissed, even gaslit. I've seen so much I can't even begin to tell you, but what I began to realize, what is really missing in both of these extreme ends of the spectrum is one and the same thing. It's reverence. Deep reverence for the feminine, for the human, for the sacred. What is actually sacred? What does it mean to have sacred sexuality and sacred partnership? There's a lot of talk going on around that, but what does it mean? When I ask myself, like, what do I get really attracted to? What turns me on? And what really comes is like integrity. Integrity is sexy. And so is honor and devotion and deep care. That kind of safety that this creates, like meeting someone in real presence and safety, it's like then the nervous system relaxes. The heart opens, the body settles, and that's when you want to open. That is when something sacred can unfold. Not when you're shamed, not when you're pressured, not when someone tells you that your boundaries are boring or spiritually immature. No, not by force. Safety that makes us want to open up to God. So what do we do? What is the third way if this religious purity culture, slut shaming isn't working, and the new age spiritualized promiscuity culture, boundary shaming isn't working either? None of them leads to more love. So what could be a third way? So when I tuned into this, like what came to me is like, okay, repression, that's of the past. It doesn't work. Indulgence also doesn't work. We're moved past that now. So what does sacred sexuality actually look like? It begins with something that I like to call erotic innocence. It's a way of relating to the body and to intimacy with deep reverence and care. Not seeing the body as a commodity you can just use and throw away like capitalist consumer culture is teaching us, but honoring it as a temple of embodied experience. Because sacred touch begins long before the bedroom. It's how you embody your daily life. It's in the way you hold a cup of tea, how your hands move through the world, in the way you lean in to listen to another person. This is where the sensual becomes truly spiritual. Not for performance, not even for pleasure, but for living presence. Another part of this path, of the third way, as I call it, is to really restore honor to the divine feminine. Again, not just in women, but those feminine qualities in all of us that make up part of our divine essence. Qualities like sensitivity, receptivity, vulnerability, relational intelligence, devotion, depth. These feminine qualities have been shamed for millennia, and now many people feel that something is shifting. That the feminine is being asked to be restored, not as a way of dominating or attacking the masculine, but as bringing back a sacred balance, a sort of restoration of true unity, where men are actually allowed to be vulnerable and women are not going to take bullshit anymore and accept shame and internalize it. But where partners meet each other in honesty and presence. And to add something more to that, I would say sacred sovereignty. That's perhaps the most important piece. When I went deeper in my communion with Yeshua, it was like that was the one thing he restored me to first. It's like sacred sovereignty. He kept saying, beloved, you're sovereign. Remember. So that means not shaming ourselves, not blaming each other, but really becoming conscious of all the patterns that we inherited through our ancestry. Because once we have the clarity and the awareness, we can choose to see it differently. We can shift our perspective and we can forgive ourselves for the ways we all collectively participated unconsciously in these dynamics. That's when we can begin to listen for a deeper voice, the voice of love. So the voice of love often speaks in whispers, and we need to attune to it, because the voice of the ego, the voice of fear, is always speaking very loudly. When we become very, very still inside, the voice for love, as A Course in Miracles calls it, can be heard. For me, it often comes in moments of prayer or automatic writing or just contemplation or just sitting in silence. And then I hear Christ's whisper. And sometimes he says things like, I am yours and you are mine. And, with the old conditioning of me, it was like, whoa, no, that is like possessiveness. And, it's like, no, beloved, he said, it's not possession, it's not control, it's recognition. This is the covenant of love itself. And it echoes the book of Isaiah, where the prophet says, you are mine, I've called you by name. And also even the ancient poetry of the Song of Songs, where the beloved say, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. I mean, isn't it just so sweet and romantic and moving to just be like, yeah, I belong to you. Not because you're claiming me or because of ownership or anything like that, but real, deep spiritual belonging. I think that creates such a safety and ease in the nervous system and in the heart. And for me, it's just like whenever I hear those words, it's just something me just exhales. And there's nothing shameful in being beloved. There's nothing primitive about devotion. And there's definitely nothing unspiritual about wanting to be met with honesty and faithfulness. In fact, I would go as far as to say that longing may be pointing us back to something sacred we simply forgot, to our belonging to the great beloved himself, herself, God, love, source. So if you find yourself navigating these questions as well as I have for many, many years, maybe you feel caught between the confusion of modern dating culture and a deeper longing for real sacred partnership. This is exactly the kind of work I support people with. In my one-on-one coaching sessions, I hold space for clients to listen deeply in stillness for the voice of love within themselves, to find their own clarity, to reclaim their own sovereignty, and ultimately to step into relationships that are aligned with truth rather than cultural conditioning, whichever end of the spectrum you may be on, or even if you're in the gray zone somewhere in between. If that resonates with you, and you're curious to explore that deeper, I'm going to leave a link for you in the show notes. Okay, beloved, so this has been a lot, so let's just take a moment together before you move on with your day. Just integrate this. Take a breath with me. And another one. And remember, you are so, so loved. So now, beloved, let these words seep like warm oil into the old wound that whispers too much or not enough. Remember, you are never alone. You are eternally held. And if this episode nourished you, please leave a review and subscribe. It helps this podcast grow and reach more hearts ready to remember love. If you wish to drink even deeper, join our community over on Substack for more intimate stories, love-drenched poetry, and sacred fire. You can find us at neriya.substack.com, and I'll also leave a link in the show notes for you. Until next time, may you remember your own sacredness. May you rest in the everlasting arms of love. And may you breathe as one beloved of God.